Welcome to Growth for Good, the show about amplifying impact for nonprofits, charities, and social purpose businesses. I'm Daniel Francavilla, a marketing advisor and brand strategist and your host. On this show, I interview leaders at nonprofits and social enterprises and the organizations that support them. We discuss the wins, challenges, and best practices when it comes to communications, marketing, fundraising, and impact. Let's dive into today's episode. Okay, well, welcome, Kavita, to Growth for Good. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I want to get started with talking a little bit about your role at ONN. What is the Ontario Nonprofit Network, firstly, in a quick pitch?
Sure. So we're an independent network for the 58,000 nonprofits in Ontario. And so we focus on policy work, advocacy, and services to help the sector thrive.
Amazing. And does that include charities as well as nonprofits? Or
Yeah.
Is it, okay.
Yeah. So when we say nonprofits, it's an all-encompassing term,
Yep.
nonprofits and charities. Yes.
Amazing. Yeah. With the show, for people who have watched other episodes, we often switch between nonprofit, charity, and then just the word organization because there's so many different types now, including, even social purpose businesses and social enterprises and associations. So it all kind of ties together. With ONN referring to all nonprofits and charities in the province.
Of course. It's a very diverse sector, and I think sometimes folks who are not in the sector don't realize that they are actually interacting with or getting services from a nonprofit because the diversity, across subsectors is so large.
Amazing. And so you're the communications and development manager right now at ONN. Can you kind of explain what that entails, both in grouping communications with development?
Sure. So talking about the link between communications and development. So development also referred to as fundraising, depending on, the organization that you work with. I look at them as similar roles with a different end goal. So on the communication side of house, you're really trying to inform and inspire and raise awareness. Whereas, with fundraising, the end goal, you want conversion. You want a donation, or you want someone to take an action, and that action doesn't always have to be tied to a financial ask. It can be sign this petition, write a letter to an MPP, which is sort of more the style that ONN would do, is that call to action, read this report, share your pre-budget submission, which is what we're doing right now. So I think, we're both trying to engage our audiences to take an action. And we go about it perhaps in similar ways, a lot of storytelling, and in different ways as well. Yeah,
and it's interesting with being part of your organization. You're almost a B2B organization in the sense that your marketing and communications are tied towards other nonprofits or other bodies, players in the sector, right? So I think that's kind of it's an important point to note because it's a different style of communication. Different tactics are used throughout in your role.
Absolutely. We're often talking to the sector.
Right.
We're not often talking to the general public.
Right. Amazing. So how did you end up in the nonprofit sector in your current role in communications?
Do you want the long version or?
Yeah, I'd love to know your journey.
Sure. So in my fourth year undergrad, I was introduced to a few nonprofits, to charities like War Child and Oxfam and Human Rights Watch, and I ended up being a volunteer for Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Watch Canada's film festival. And I really fell in love with the work that they were doing, and I was young and had energy and wanted to change the world, and that felt like the right sector to do that in. At the time, I was on the path to becoming a lawyer.
Okay.
And all of a sudden, that didn't feel like the right path. So after I graduated with an undergrad degree, it's sort of hard to get your first opportunities. So I took what I could get, which was in the corporate sector. And I knew right away that was not the right fit for me. So I went to school part-time and did fundraising management at now TMU. And yeah, my first sort of role in the sector was at Ontario Nature, and I developed a love for turtles there.
Wow.
But it wasn't long before I realized that I was perhaps better at and more interested in the communications side as opposed to the fundraising side of things. And yeah, it's been about a decade, probably more, since then. And my roles have varied in the sector, but they've all included communications. And in the last few years, the focus has been a little more on digital engagement.
Got it. So coming into the role of communications, you were trained with the mindset of the nonprofit space when it comes to fundraising, which is great. There's a lot of people, even some on the show, that went into a traditional background or of branding and marketing for the business world and then brought that to nonprofit. So yeah, it's always great to hear about the different paths that professionals take in our space. So obviously being here at a nonprofit organization, and you work and serve nonprofits through ONN as well. You've been a volunteer and an activist yourself. Tell us about some of the causes or issues that you're personally passionate about.
Sure. So I'll cheat here and use an umbrella term called social justice because it's hard for me to sort of pick one small thing. I think, advancing social justice sort of for me includes, climate. It includes, access to decent work for all workers. I want everyone to feel safe at work and at home, and I want barriers to opportunity and joy to be removed from people based on their identities. And I think that sort of utopian world doesn't exist unless we fight systems of oppression. And I think there's a lot of work to do. We've definitely come a long way. We've made strides, but I think what upsets me the most is that those strides can be taken away based on political whim. And I don't think, people's access to justice and opportunity and in their lives should be impacted by who's in power. But in order for that not to be the reality, we would need a whole new way to organize our society. So, but I'm for it. I think, let's try something different. This isn't working for everyone. So.
Got it.
Yeah.
And so you, I guess, have the opportunity to serve or work with a lot of organizations that are filling gaps, you could say, right? That are not currently being addressed. So, but that is the reality, is this kind of, we live in a very cyclical world where projects and funding is announced and taken away and promised and moved around and reallocated. And even when something's committed, it doesn't always turn out the way that it was intended. So it is a constant, evolution. And it's great, though. I think for you in your role, you get to see so many organizations taking action, tens of thousands of them.
I think, and during COVID, especially, cringe word now, but it was unprecedented at the time. But we really saw this sector be so innovative and, do what they needed to do to serve their communities. And I think that's not appreciated as much as it should be. And we're very resilient. We're, find ways to work around the barriers that are thrown at us, which are a lot of them. And funding's always an issue. And, it's not as fulsome. But from ONN's perspective, we're trying for that policy change, so to create a policy environment that makes it easier, that enables nonprofits to do the work that they want to do, that they need to do.
And more importantly, that work, that can be sustainable.
Yes.
Because, as you're very much aware, funding cycles change and grant availability changes and things like that. So on the first season of the show, we had Rohit from Do Good Fundraising, who specifically focused on grant writing and applications. And, during the pandemic, as you mentioned, there was a massive shift in what funding became available.
Right.
So we had, thousands of organizations trying to pivot and adapt their own operations and then adjust how they can serve differently based on what different funding became available. So I think there's a lot of pivoting and adapting. And you mentioned kind of the idea of resilience in the sector. So that's a huge part. I think it just comes with being in the sector, right? Is that resilience?
Yeah, I mean, for better or for worse, we adapt well and we pivot well, and it's especially during COVID, there was a lot of, okay, well, let's pivot to this and let's pivot to that because this is what's going on.
Right.
And it didn't allow for long-term planning because we didn't know what the next few months held. So now as we sort of go back to planning longer term, I think there's, COVID has changed some things for the better, but other things not so much. So, we have to do our work accordingly in the new context with the new realities that exist.
Absolutely. So if we take kind of bigger picture view and look at the whole idea of mobilizing people and kind of using, communications and digital platforms to do that, what's kind of been your experience there, and what can you share about that?
I will share that sometimes it feels like you're screaming into the void and no one cares, but that's okay. I feel like that comes as part of it's part of the territory. I think, where you build your community is where you'll see the most success, however you define success. In my personal life, it was very humble. To me, it was if one person thought of something differently, or if I got, reached one person with new information about whether it was human trafficking or, child marriage or whatever it was that I was raising awareness about, my goals were different. But when you work at an organization, whether it's a charity or a nonprofit, the bar is a little bit higher. But I think there's, obviously social media has become a crowded space, but again, you have to think about what your value proposition is and why should anybody follow you? What are you saying that's interesting or different than what other people are not saying? And what are you bringing to the table? So I think there's value in being a space where other information is curated. There probably isn't anything that you're saying that isn't already on the internet. But if you're a one-stop shop and that's what we're trying to be for nonprofits, right? Is all the policy information that you need, come to us, we'll provide it. So there is value in curating what's on the internet into one place, but also figuring out what's your message, what does it, do for people, why as an organization should someone follow you, but then why as a person should I follow you? And I think, every platform has something different to offer. It offers different opportunities to communicate different aspects of your work. And, what I've learned over the years with charities that do lots of different work, lots of different projects, it's hard for them to distill down because well, wait, what do you do? Oh, you work on this and this and that and that. There has to be one tying thread. And although you want to be proud of the work that you do and the impact that you have, we're obsessed with communicating about impact. And so you want to do that, but you also don't want to confuse your audience. And I think that's an important role that comms plays is, well, what's the tying thread? What's connecting all of this together, right? How do we connect the dots for people in an easy way? That's the other thing, is that people's attention span is perhaps not what it used to be, thanks to the internet. So in a quick way, what's the key message without simplifying to the point where you're taking away the integrity of the work? But
that's a huge tip, both for activists themselves as individuals and for organizations. I think that's a great thing to tie in. A lot of times the perspectives that you have is you're informed on the issue, you understand why it's so important, you're ready to live and breathe it, but you're not necessarily thinking about meeting people where they're at, right? And sometimes the extra passion and excitement and knowledge about a topic can get in the way from how you're simplifying that communication, right? And you've kind of given some examples of that too. And that comes down to what platforms people are on, where they're paying most attention, and what type of content are they looking for.
For sure.
It's not always about sharing a 40-page report,
Nope.
even though you know what's valuable in that report. It's really, I like that you mentioned the word distill, right? Distilling that down into digestible information that's appropriate for the audience and appropriate for the platform.
And it's what are the key messages, but also knowing your own audience is important, right? So ONN's audience are often policy folks. They will read longer things, right? They will read a long email. They will read a report. But, it's what channel do we give that information to you on? And when we're sharing something longer on Twitter, how does that adapt? And I think, I still see nonprofits, sort of putting out the same message on all of their platforms and not optimizing to each platform, which I understand. It's a capacity, and it's sort of funny, as you asked me, the link between communications and development. Depending on the organization, it might be the same department or the same human. So, so sometimes there isn't a lot of separation. And so I understand that, but I think where there is capacity, you'll see the fruits of your labor in terms of engagement if you really do pay attention to the channel, your own audience. I know that not everybody tracks their, the spaghetti that they're throwing at the wall. Like, how did it perform? Do people like the spaghetti or not? And again, a lot of that comes down to capacity, but, that there's value in knowing what's working for your audience. And even if what's working isn't what you actually want them to take away, it's how do you work with it? How do you bring people into the fold with those messages and then, push your own message. A lot of the times, whether they're a nonprofit or a charity or organization, they fall into the trap of always talking about your own work. You're always just talking about yourself.
Right.
And that's boring to a follower, right? Like if we think about how many folks, our own social media, is that who you follow? Is somebody who keeps talking about themselves? Not really, right? There's value in showing the work that you're doing, but I think there's a happy balance. Kara mentioned in her episode about being reactive and, the value of being reactive to what's going on. You have to be relevant. Otherwise, on social media, again, you're going to scream into the void and nobody's going to engage.
Yeah.
So how do you make the connection between what's going on, what's relevant for people in Ontario right now, and how do we jump into that conversation and say something that is meaningful and not just surface level?
Exactly. And when you look at the idea of, this show is about amplifying impact, looking at, you spoke about who your audience is, meeting them where they're at, but also what is that audience most likely to share with their followers as well? So, when we talk about just talking about yourself, yes, a certain percentage of your content should do that because you are your own best advocate in that case. Yeah. But a lot of it could be about highlighting the people that you're supporting and highlighting, providing tailored content to your stakeholders and to your audience, with the intention of them being able to share that. And
shareable content, right?
Exactly.
It's a whole category.
It is. And you mentioned the idea earlier of kind of a curator, like being a curator of all this knowledge and resources, which ONN is, of course, but individual organizations and brands and leaders can be curators of what's happening with current events, what's happening in the sector, what's happening with their own communities that they serve, because people follow you for various reasons.
Yes.
One of those is that they, of course, align with the cause and support the work you do, but they also have people are very multidimensional, right?
Absolutely.
So looking at how you can make those connections and curate for them, I think it's a great point.
Yeah, and different things will interest different people, right? So at ONN, somebody might be really interested in our Reimagining Governance project, but then they're not as interested in our other policy work. So, they may follow us because they like that one style of content, but hopefully they would see parallels between our other work and sort of be more engaged. But I think social media can sometimes, those algorithms can be cruel. So, if people pass by your content a few times on Instagram, then they're not coming back, because Instagram won't serve it up. So I think knowing that is important, knowing your channel and how it's going to serve up your content, and knowing what Google likes and how people get to your website, because people have misconceptions. I've often had folks within organizations be like, well, I'm on the homepage and I can't find it. It's like, well, that's not how most people are getting to this page.
Yep.
And it's too bad that you can't find it. But, we're giving people the link to the page. That's how they're going to get there. Or they're going to Google the words and be served up that page. So I think, navigation, user experience, certainly things to think about, but there's lots of websites that need work in our sector. But again, it all comes down to capacity and funding, and I know that not all organizations have that, and especially frontline services. They're serving community, and that's their number one priority. So I understand why that's the case. I just hope for the better for them when I get to websites that look like they were made on Microsoft Word.
Well, and sometimes, exactly, and sometimes, you may know that organization and the value they provide, but for someone who's first arriving on the website, let's say they found them in a directory or someone referred them, they may not actually get to the meat and the value of that. Yeah. Sometimes you may learn that their best resources come through an email newsletter, which you may have no idea of what comes into that newsletter until you've been a subscriber. So there's a lot of things that organizations can do to kind of tease that content, let people know, incentivize them to get on the list, and also make that content not only exclusive to that one location. So I love that you mentioned websites, because that's been, I've been working with organizations for, over a decade that are looking to have websites built. Sometimes they put all their eggs in that one basket. Yep. Sometimes their website is a complete afterthought.
Right.
I've had clients, for example, in the past that have invested in like a video series or an annual report, but then it doesn't live somewhere where people can actually locate it, right? So to your point, being searchable, making the content digestible, and looking at what your audience is looking for. Ultimately, it's just a better use of resources, right?
Oh, for sure. And again, it's like, if you can invest in it, you will see the fruits of that labor, right? If people can find your content more easily, if people can find, your reports more easily, then they will support you and they will champion your work because it's going to be useful for them. So, ONN recently, we redid our website, and it's like, if people can find our publications easier, it'll make it, better for them. And so how do you use your website as a tool? It should be a tool that's, amplifying and supporting your work. So,
it's a tool, and it's one tool.
It's one of the many tools that should be in your tool belt. But
Exactly. So I want to talk about, we kind of touch on some of the challenges here, but what are one or two challenges that you've experienced or you've kind of been part of at either this current organization or any other that you've worked in?
I mean, I think this sort of ongoing challenge will be ways to engage audiences, right? We know competition's high. Everybody's online all the time. Everybody's on their phone all the time. You may be scrolling Instagram all the time, but how do you compete with cute animal videos or, viral dancing TikToks? How do you seep in? And perhaps that's not your audience. And I think
maybe your audience isn't there. That's one good point.
Maybe your audience isn't watching dog videos, although I watch dog videos all day long when I'm not working. But I think, figuring out new ways, keeping up with the platforms that are changing, how their algorithms are changing, how they want to serve up content to the users on the platforms. I think that's going to continue to be a challenge because they change all the time. Right. Like all the algorithms, are often changing, and because the platform wants to serve up the user the content that they like and that they want to engage most with.
Right.
So how do you become that? How do you, even though, ONN's Instagram account has over 1,000 followers, our posts don't have 1,000 likes. You're never going to reach everybody that follows you. Most of them are not active very often. But, so how do you, right now, if we're reaching, 5% of our audience, how do you tick that up? Or how do you keep them? Like, keeping the audience that you have engaged, whatever percentage that is going to get harder. So, and it has gotten harder. So how do we strategize to keep them there? And how do we, again, throw the spaghetti at the wall, but then see what sticks? And I think we have to, in communications, always keep thinking of new ideas and bring back some old ideas that work. I think so much of what works on social is being authentic and not being a brand. Be humans, like show one of our consistent top 10 pages is our staff page. People are curious about other people, so then show them the people,
Yes.
like give them insight into your organization. I mean, do it in a way that feels appropriate or whatever. But yeah, there's often our executive director who, doesn't have a lot of time. But, I often encourage her. I was like, share your reflections. People want them. People want your learnings. People want you're in a position that's relatable to a lot of folks in the sector. And your learnings are things that people can learn from, and what are you thinking about and what are you reflecting on? And people will see similarities or they'll have ideas based on what you're sharing because you're a person.
Yes.
When ONN shares a blog, it's different than when Kathy shares a blog, right? So I think that human touch is important. Even though we do policy work, and policy work doesn't lend itself to fun visuals, so it's tough. But how do you make that content? How do you make your organization relatable and social?
Yep.
I have tweeted out a picture of our dogs, on National Dog Day or whatever, just to show the human side of the organization. So yeah, I think that's. I don't even know if I answered your question.
Well, yeah. I mean, you didn't not only answer talking about what the challenges are, but you gave very actionable tips, which is to show personality, show behind the scenes, highlight your team, and from the perspective of you kind of mentioned maybe a leader or the executive director, using their own voice and using their personal platforms. Sure. I think that goes a really long way today because. This whole trend of thought leadership is people are looking like who's the expert, who's someone who's a trusted source, even though as a leader, you may not consider yourself an expert because everyone's continuously learning and evolving. People that we spoke about earlier offline, Paul Taylor, Rakesh, who was a previous guest as well. He was an executive director who's now shifted to working in his own practice. People that actually have those voices and those personal brands, they will attract an audience that follows them from role to role to role.
For sure.
And that's super valuable, right? Because it's not just your current organization, but you're building credibility and authority and trust with the audience in general. And it helps to amplify your message ultimately, right? There is benefit to that.
Yeah, because there's a clear values alignment with your work and what you personally stand for and believe in. And I think part of what makes them such, attractive leaders and people, follow them and their work and respect them is because they say the things that so many want to say but don't say, because of fear of repercussion or, funders or whatever it may be. So I think there's value in being honest and taking that risk and saying the things that need to be said, and then figuring out, well, how do we change that? It's not enough to just identify the problem, which our sector is great at doing. There's lots of problems, but what's the solution? Or how do we work towards finding the solution? And how can we come together to make this better? I think, yeah.
And advocacy, right? You're not just declaring the problem, but you're advocating
Yep.
for an issue or for a group or for a community. I think there's power in that. Even if you don't have the answers, there's power in sharing this, and people can align and relate with that, which, like you mentioned, values alignment is, if that's the goal of all of your communications, then that's a success. It's people aligning with you on a values level.
For sure.
So that being said, in this sector, we know with nonprofits and charities of all kinds, it's important to showcase our impact, showcase our successes. What are some wins that you've experienced either at ONN or with any of the organizations you've been a part of over the years that you'd like to share?
So, I mean, from an ONN perspective, there's certainly policy wins, but since this is more a communications-related conversation, I'll sort of talk about comms-related wins. We recently, as I mentioned, redid our website, and that sometimes takes organizations a really long time.
Oh, yeah.
And we worked with an incredible team to help us do that. And it feels like a win because, people are finding our stuff a little bit easier. We're seeing the results in the metrics. And I know Google Analytics is changing, GA4 causing some stress, or people don't even know what it is, and it will cause stress in the future. But I think, that felt like success because we were able to then better showcase the work that our policy team is doing.
Right.
By making it easier to find, but also creating a user experience that made sense. And we certainly had accessibility in mind with, colors and font size and all that stuff to be, AOTA compliant. Mm-hmm. And so that certainly felt like success. And our last survey report that launched, it got some media coverage, which again, media is sort of coveted still within the sector, and which to me is a double edge. It's great because it helps get your message across to a broader audience, which is really important, especially for organizations like ONN, because we're talking about the value of the sector. We're talking about the size and the impact of the sector, and how our sector impacts everyone, touches everyone's lives in Ontario. And I think there's some misunderstandings of the impact of our sector and the size of our sector and how we are, an economic contributor. I think it's funny when I read your question about passion, for the sector. It's like, well, there's over 840,000 people that work in the sector. Not everyone is actually in their role because they're passionate about a cause. We're an employer. Mm-hmm. Some people work in the sector because it's a job, and it may be a good job, and they may feel good about the fact that they're working for a good cause, but they're not necessarily passionate about the cause. It was a bit of a hard lesson I've learned over the years, And I think sometimes that passion is exploited, because you're passionate about the cause, you're willing to go above and beyond, and, work-life balance becomes a non-existent thing. So
yeah, and actually, I'll jump in and say that we've noticed a trend from multiple guests on the show who have talked about, the risk of burnout in the sector specifically, and that could be one of those reasons. But that's one of the tips that a lot of the guests have shared is to focus on, actually taking care of yourself, because you can't do good work if you're not taking care of your own self as well. Mm-hmm. You can't make a positive impact as well. So
right. I mean, and it's funny because we have been, right? So many folks, especially on the front lines, if you work at a women's shelter, it's hard to be like, well, I need self-care in the face of someone, who has immediate needs. Mm-hmm. And it's important, but I think inevitably it becomes hard to put yourself before the community that you serve and the folks that you serve. And I think that's, certainly it's part of why burnout is happening and it's always been an issue in this sector. But I think that's where policy is important. I'll plug sort of O&N's work again in terms of making sure all workers have access to decent work, and that they are valued above and beyond the contributions that they make. You're a human, you're a person first. You have a life outside of your work, and that's important. And that your care and your mental health and your physical health and all of those things are important to take care of.
Love that. One of the common themes of Growth for Good so far, for sure. So we'll wrap up by talking about if there's a source of inspiration or resource, whether it's a book, a podcast, anything like that. Obviously, ONN is a massive resource. Your website, you can definitely dive into that as well. But is there anything that you turn to kind of keep inspired or informed?
Sure. No shortage of PDFs to download on our website. It's funny. I used to joke about this at my previous role, is that I didn't come into communications because I was passionate about communications. It's because I was passionate about the cause that I worked for. Yes. And I just happened to be good at communications. So, with our program staff, I used to joke about, I don't care about Instagram inherently. It's just that I know what content will work there. So it's sort of funny. I don't look for inspiration in, comms, marketing, like magazines. Of course, by virtue of my work, I need to keep up to date and I need to know what's going on. So, I certainly, get the HubSpot newsletter and Hootsuite and, all those sort of websites that give you other tools or reports or, here's what the algorithms are doing today. But most of my inspiration comes from people. Like, people move me. I'm inspired by people's stories. I use that not to forget why I came into the sector. Like, why do I care about social justice? It's because of people, and making sure that I'm reading or engaging with people from vast walks of life, and understanding what their path has been, understanding what their sources of inspiration are, and just not losing sight of the bigger picture. I don't ever want to be in this sector and not care about the people in the sector or the people that the sector, aims to serve, because then I've lost my way. So yeah, my inspiration certainly comes from people and their stories, and there's a lot of amazing people doing really amazing work. And one of the things, talk a lot about leadership, but I think, you don't have to be in a role of leadership or have a title that indicates leadership for you to be a leader, for you to be someone who inspires. And for leaders in this sector, I will say that whether you think it's the case or not, people are looking up to you. So act accordingly.
Amazing. That last part right there is a perfect piece of advice for leaders of all kinds in the sector. So thank you so much, Kavita, for joining us on Growth for Good today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to this episode of Growth for Good. The show is presented by Daniel Does and produced by CreatorClub in Toronto. You can find notes, links, and more about my guests at danieldoes.co, where you can also learn about ways we can collaborate. Feel free to connect with me anytime on LinkedIn or Twitter. If there is someone from the sector that you'd like to learn from or you'd like to be interviewed on the show, feel free to reach out to team@danieldoes.co. If you're considering creating a podcast or video series for your organization, connect with Creator Club at creatorclubstudios.com.